Okay, well, welcome again to the Astrology of Family Karma and Relationships podcast. I'm your host, Alexander Mallon, and today we have a special guest who really needs no introduction, someone who has really been sort of become a foundation of modern Western astrology, Steven Forrest. Thank you so much, Steven, for coming and sharing with us today.
I'm happy to be here, Alexander.
So nice to have you. So I've got a couple of slides for those people who are watching on our YouTube channel. Today our talking is kind of loose. I think Stephen and I were chatting before hitting the record button, and we're really kind of going to just rap about astrology and astronomy since I know that Stephen and I share passions in both areas. So maybe our title, Stephen, could be Astrology and Astronomy Unified, sort of a general chat. I do want to also say for those people who are watching and listening that Stephen Forrest is an American astrologer, author of well over a dozen books. I think about 16 or
Yeah,
17 books
yeah,
now.
17 books now.
Good gracious, amazing. And the founder of the School of Evolutionary Astrology. So, by all means, if you feel inclined, you please tell us about yourself or anything you want to share, maybe your recent publication.
Well, gee, where to start? Well, I'll talk about where I actually started with astrology, and it was with astronomy. My
Mm.
my first memory, or very close to my first memory, as a child, was asking Santa Claus to bring me a telescope. And what I had in mind was the Mount Palomar Observatory. What my
Fantastic.
parents, who represented Santa Claus, understood was I wanted like a little spyglass, and so that's what I got. I was pretty disappointed, but shortly after that, I got myself a little 60 millimeter refractor, the old 2.4-inch refractor telescope, that long,
Beautiful.
and began to just observe the heavens. And this is the 1950s, early 60s, and the world was still pretty conservative in those days, and I was being raised conventionally. So I was like kind of a science kid. I was doing science, looking through the telescope. And those are not dirty words to me even today. But I intuitively I began to get this feeling that when I'm looking at planets, when I'm looking at galaxies, that it's like something was looking back at me. And I'm not thinking of the little green men, although I suspect they're out there too. But
Yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
but
could be.
but that somehow I was looking at conscious things, and which is blasphemy, from a 20th century science point of view. But of course, an ancient idea, the Gaia hypothesis that the cosmos is a living being, the cosmos is a consciousness, and looking through telescopes with your heart open, that perception, which is the heart of astrology, really, the wellspring of astrology. It just flooded into my consciousness and changed me forever. That's why I didn't turn out to be a scientist.
Yeah, well, I love that because my rap is that when I was 8 and a half, my dad, a military guy, had his pair of binoculars and a bird feeder, and I was fascinated, and I memorized the Eastern Bird Guide in about 3 or 4 weeks. Eventually, my dad got us into the Audubon Society, of course. But from there, I built a microscope and then started building telescopes when I was in my very early teens. I didn't grind optics, but
Yeah.
I did climb the creaky stairs to Jaeger's optical supply house, and had quite a funny encounter with the German guys who were quite German back then. They were very rigorous in their work. So I too started with, as a Capricorn myself as well. I started
Uh-huh.
studying astrology because, as a backyard astronomer, a telescope builder, people would say, "Oh, you're an astrologer," and I'd say, "No, no, 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 no. I'm an amateur backyard astronomer." And I thought, well, I better study this astrology business so I can, kind of get people thinking straight here, get their thinking scientifically accurate. And within 2 weeks, I thought, wait a second, this is an incredible experience. This astrology is way more than I knew that it could possibly be. So that was,
Yeah.
now five decades ago. But yeah, similarly, that passion for the night sky. When I was 4.5, I wanted a trampoline, never got one, and I wanted a telescope. We couldn't possibly afford it, but as I got older, I started building them. So yeah, the same thing. I do, Stephen. Still, I honestly think between you and I, when I go to astronomy star parties, which I do 3 or 4 times a year, I think a lot of those amateur astronomers who are by and large almost always not into astrology, I think
Yeah,
they're
yeah,
experiencing that sense of Gaia, that mystery. I think that they're actually getting more of a sort of a humane and human download from their backyard observing than they might know.
yeah. I think so. The world is changing for astrology. It's just, I'm 76, and I've watched us go from marginalized to sort of objects of interest and curiosity, not exactly acceptance, but I'm encountering much more open-mindedness, among kind of mainstream people, which is wonderful. It's the result of the hard work that we've all been doing.
Absolutely. There's been a radical shift. And of course, I don't know if you agree, but astrologically, a lot of well, indeed, the Pluto, Neptune, Uranian cycles that we're having in the US chart, for an example,
Mhm.
are kind of replications of big turning points and, big turning points in the 60s by all means.
Yeah,
So we're kind of
yeah.
having that. I haven't seen the bell bottoms come back yet, but astrology seems to be making a sort of 60s comeback. Uh,
Yeah, definitely. We can see interesting things in the US chart. Fair enough, that's quite accurate. But I would also point out that this is not a US phenomenon.
right.
This is international. This is global.
Absolutely. Yeah, by all means, that's a sort of fundamental. I think because of course I'm like so many Americans, Americentric, and most of my clients are here in the U.S., the great majority.
Yeah.
That in the last few years, I've been really looking at the U.S. chart with their chart a great deal. It's almost as a matter
Hmm.
of norm now, where for decades and decades, there was a sense of U.S. autonomy that if you wanted to become an astrologer or whatever, you could follow your passion. But
Hmm.
we're having cycles now that I think are kind of superseding or overarching, as we have had in different chapters. That's what
Yeah.
I oftentimes will have my clients chart and a U.S. chart as well to discuss these larger cycles, as you just
Uh-huh.
alluded
Mhm.
to. So yeah,
My
um,
work is has become quite international. My books are translated a lot. I travel to other countries fairly often to teach. My clients are I've never I don't do a statistical analysis here, but I would say 35-40% of my clients are not from the United States
wow,
at this
mhm,
point. And I appreciate that.
absolutely.
It's easy as an American. I mean, we're cancer, and surrounded by oceans and, et cetera. And it's easy to become very insular as an American. And I'm happy that life has kind of disabused me of that.
Well, good for you. Yeah, absolutely. I've only kind of have a taste of that in my life and in my practice. So wonderful for you to be sure to clarify that
Yeah. Yeah.
this wonderful unified world is really where we
Uh-huh.
are. I kind of always think of it as, connected to this gizmo that's tucked away in my
Yeah,
back pocket,
yeah,
the unity.
exactly. And when I
So
first started traveling internationally, I was worried that maybe my values and my experience and so on were so conditioned by being an American hippie, essentially. That's kind of my roots, and that's a very specific worldview.
yeah,
And I was afraid that when I got to Istanbul or something, or Shanghai, they would have no idea what I was talking about. And delightfully, I found that wasn't true. That this language is so universal that no matter what culture a person is in, they get it. I've learned to try to sound a little less American, like inside American jokes that aren't going to work in Istanbul or Shanghai. But it's not too hard to edit those out. And the basic human stuff of, work and love, the two things that everybody's driven by and
yeah.
concerned about, there's different cultural angles, but the astrological language cuts through that and right to the heart of the matter, and tears in their eyes, as I talk about this stuff, pretty much no matter what country I'm in. It's encouraging, One world, one people. That was the
I, I,
dedication of my first book.
well, I love that. I love that. And that partly prompted my reaching out to you for to join me today was listening to a number of podcasts like with Chris Brennan, so forth that you've done over the years. Of course, I've seen you at conferences and had the luck to hear you speak and share. But I do see some important parallels and things that I really identify with and appreciate in your work. So maybe at this point, before we go any further, could you share a little bit about your School of Evolutionary Astrology and what's sort of behind those ideas?
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's real exciting. We kind of started putting it together during the COVID time, and it's an online school. We've got a couple hundred active students at any given moment, a
Mm.
large staff of tutors. Forrest with two R's, Forrest Astrology dot Center, and as the website can learn all about it. It's
I'll put your data at the
I,
on the program notes, by the way,
yeah,
for people
okay,
to
well,
pick up
yeah,
on.
that I appreciate that. That would be helpful. And it's basically my drive to start the school is me being aware of where I am in the life cycle. I'm getting older, and so eventually I'm not here anymore. And
Mm.
to keep the flame burning, of this kind of astrology. I don't use asteroids that much, but they're interesting. And I have Vesta, the sacred flame, right on my ascendant. And
Ah,
when I first discovered that, yeah, it's a metaphor I've always used of the keeping the sacred flame burning. And what I mean by that is not just astrology, but a metaphysical, spiritually oriented kind of astrology. That's what puts the sacred in it. So you're a Gemini, you talk too much, you're a Virgo, you're picky and critical. There's nothing sacred about that, and often nothing very accurate about that kind of astrology either. So
right.
evolutionary astrology is very much its own thing, and I've devoted my life to it.
So I have the impression that what drives the construct of evolutionary astrology is centers around not only this incarnation, this sense of selfness in this being, this journey,
Yeah,
but the idea of as many cultures, I always say, kind of tongue in cheek, but two-thirds of the world believes in reincarnation. I think even in Christian mysticism, there was a
yeah,
belief and references to the
yeah,
soul's
yeah.
journey. So what you're referring to also is that a birth chart is not only, I think, a typical Western kind of a construct, a roadmap for the soul, or a roadmap of
Yeah.
the soul, but it's literally describing the soul, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Reincarnation, the belief and acceptance of reincarnation are really the cornerstone of evolutionary astrology. You're totally right about that. But often in presenting the idea to people, to other astrologers, that's not where I like to begin. Here's where I like to begin. I like to, there's a question I like to ask. It makes almost everybody laugh and smile, except a few really defensive people. And so here it is. I hope you enjoyed this question.
Yeah.
Just think of how dumb you were 10 years ago. And occasionally somebody's really brittle and they get peeved about that. But it's actually a compliment, because
Yeah.
you got something to show for 10 years. You're wiser now than you were 10 years ago. And I've never met anybody who, at least when we talk about it a little bit, can't relate to that idea. And the notion is we are evolving beings. We don't need to think in terms of reincarnation to recognize that. We can think about it in terms of our own lives. Now I'll go micro and then macro on that. Here's a question that probably has an answer, although nobody can answer it. Think how dumb you were 6 nanoseconds ago. It's too subtle for us to grasp, but it's like this sort of quantum notion that if we're wiser after 10 years, it's incremental, step by step, and each nanosecond, we're evolving. And that's kind of the micro end. And then we get into the macro territory. So why do you have the chart that you have? Why were you born, with that particular birth chart? There's two ways of answering that question that are both rational. One, random chance, I don't believe that, but that's a rational position. And the second is something made you have that chart. It's either random or it's not. And if something made you have that chart, if there is a cause behind your chart that predates your birth, that doesn't prove reincarnation, but it's certainly consistent with it. That wheels were turning somehow. A baby is born, look into that kid's eyes, there's somebody home. How did that person get in there? And again, I would never present these as proofs of reincarnation, but the language of reincarnation fits smoothly into those observations. And so you are born, me, everybody, in a certain karmic predicament. We've got certain strengths and certain blind spots, and they're all reflected in the chart. And the chart is the good part. The chart tells you how to get on with it, what your next steps are, what you're learning, what your
And
path of evolution is.
I, I love what you're sharing. So much so, of course, the title, not that it's the only thing I focus on in my practice, etc. Obviously, there are layers for all of us. But the title of my podcast is kind of a giveaway to the central thrust of my fifth house stellium in my Capricorn case,
Hmm.
which is the astrology of family karma, and,
Yeah,
and really how we therefore relate. So, meaning, uh, really, I think it's parallel to what you're saying. That number one, how dumb was I 10 nanoseconds ago? How dumb was I,
yeah,
compared to now 10 years ago? Or this idea that
yeah.
I share with my clients often, that I think most of us subliminally, culturally, interculturally, aspire that when we're 20 or 30, we think when I'm older, when I'm 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, I will possess wisdom. I will be a bearer of
Yeah,
wisdom. And I will say,
yeah,
what is that being a bearer of wisdom? It eventually is more and more the ability to be out, sort of, I think of Ram Dass here, to be outside our body, to watch our movie, to watch ourselves. I
yeah,
always say to my clients very commonly, I'll say, even during our session, I'm kind of practiced with intent, with intention of
yeah,
consciousness, to watch Alexander do Alexander's trip, to watch Alexander do Alexander's
yeah,
trip right now with Stephen, to have the ability to watch
yeah,
self while being self. And that's kind of a metaphor for the chart, a person's birth chart,
yeah,
the astronomical sky when we're born, as your one of your book
yeah,
titles, the inner sky, I believe. That
The
sky
inner skies, yeah,
above, the
first one.
sky inside. Is there a difference? There is no difference. If you're born during a
Yeah,
blizzard,
mhm,
if you're a Capricorn born during a blizzard, proverbial blizzard, that's one reality for mom and dad and for the infant that's arriving. If you're born, I always use Bill Clinton. If you're born as a Leo during, if you're born during a Leo pool party, or maybe a Bill Clinton Leo a margarita party, you're
mhm,
imprinted with that too. So I feel like there's a couple of different layers. One is this material spiritual plane,
yeah,
where we are experiencing this beingness. But as you say, inherent in that moment, that chart, that moment, that 9 months and 12 hours of labor brings us through mom's body into this
yeah,
spiritual place, this physical spiritual. Inherent in that is that time space, which, from an astronomy standpoint, time space, that's why I think, a birth chart, we see it as a circular wheel, but really it's like a cylinder in time and space, it's sort of a
yeah, yeah,
snapshot of a moment of that soul's journey. And therefore the
yeah,
chart
yeah, yeah,
shows everything. The chart shows in medical
yeah,
diagnostic astrology, it shows those genetic predispositions and potentials.
yeah,
And at the same
yeah,
time, it's all that immediate moment of the doing. So I think I'm hearing in what you're sharing and some of what I think I've read about your work, this
yeah,
idea that yes, we bring forward. even genetically, our soul comes to these people that have a storyline that mirrors the vibration of our soul, perhaps our soul journey. But every moment is a new moment, as you say, year by
Yeah.
year, day by day, nanosecond by nanosecond, this consciousness piece. So I'm kind of riffing a little more than I thought I would, but that's my Mercury Jupiter conjunction.
Yeah. Yeah, it's working.
Sorry.
Yeah. And what you're saying, what it sort of triggers creatively in me, it's a memory of a panel I was on once at some big astrology conference at UAC or something like that, and on the panel it was like I think the basic subject was where is God in the chart? You know, it was kind of the spiritual subject, and many of the astrologers were giving answers that made sense technically in the sort of Pisces, Neptune, 12th house vein, you know, the mystical symbols. And but my answer was a little bit different. I said, you know, you visualize a birth chart with all the planets, the familiar look, the space outside the space outside the chart, the blank paper, you know, that's God, you know, that's like the solar system is an analog for the human personality. In a sense, the ego, well, I'm not using that word negatively, but you know, our sense of identity. And and then it's like what's beyond it. And an adjunct to this, a big hoorah, of course, when Pluto got demoted. You know, Pluto's a dwarf planet, and astrologers are all peeved about that. And of course, we use Pluto as a planet. There's no doubt about that. But there's something I liked about it. If we let Neptune be the last planet, it's like the window through which we're looking into deep space. And we look into deep space, first thing we might see is Pluto, you know, some scary stuff. But the idea of Neptune as the window, which leads me to kind of a Zen question, which is the windows in your house. Are they inside your house or outside your house? And of course, one can make both cases. And Neptune is that part of us, that part of the ego. See, there's the startling line. Neptune is part of the ego that is aware of the space outside the ego, that is aware of our spiritual natures, the unconscious mind, God, the spirit realm, the Dharmakaya, you know, whatever name we want to call it, but Neptune as that interface. And that's the model that really makes the most sense to me.
I'm in concert with that. I think it's, of course, I mean, well, it's real. I mean, it's
Yeah,
scientifically factual. It's scientifically
yeah, yeah,
factual that and observationally reasonable too. Like in terms of a backyard astronomer standpoint,
yeah,
number one,
yeah,
uh, when I look through my C14 14-inch diameter telescope or my 16, but the 14 is a better planetary scope really. So when I look through my C14
yeah,
at Neptune, for me, it really is otherworldly. It's almost sort of like Shakti hitting me. It's almost like a mini
yeah,
Shakti kind of experience, realizing I'm seeing this planet and its moon Triton in real time, 3 billion miles away. 3 billion. I always have to remind myself the moon is 230,000 miles from us. 3 billion is
yeah,
unfathomable. Where I'm making
yeah,
contact with this
yeah,
this experience, this Neptune.
yes,
So there's that experiential piece, that real time piece. It's real. Pluto's just beyond the reach in a way of being seen, astronomically. I'm kind of really earthing this stuff, you know. Um,
yeah,
Simultaneously, you know, there's that coincidence of Neptune's discovery, I think 1843. What arose in man's experience collectively when we discover any of these planets, when
yeah,
we see
yeah.
the
It's so
unseen.
synchronistic.
Right, that Jungian synchronicity, that the coincidence I say of Neptune. What is Neptune to us? It's all those things that were happening in the 1800s, the development of film emulsion, the invention of chemicals and chemical states, compounds, chemical compounds and pharmacology that had never been invented before, not of nature, but created of nature, but
Yeah,
synthesized. So, Neptune is coincident, as we all astrologers give it we hang these sort of ideas on what Neptune is. It's about what it
yeah,
is for us in our experience, you know. So it
yeah,
is that
yeah,
liminal and subliminal crossover place. It's an interesting thing you're saying.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the discovery of Neptune, 1848, I believe it was
Thank you.
exactly. The rise of spiritualism, in North America and Europe, the communion with the dead, and Ouija boards and mediums and psychics and all of that, and obviously there's some delusion and no shortage of charlatans, but there's also objective reality in all of that, and the point simply is that as Neptune was discovered, as it was sort of activated in the collective mind, people began to recognize that I have this window inside myself. I can look through this window myself into the spirit realm and see spirit looking back at me. I don't need the priest to
I,
describe what he is
yeah,
seeing through the window,
right.
and I just put money in the plate, that I can do this myself. And what it's very difficult for us living today in the 21st century who take this for granted to imagine what a revolution the discovery of Neptune represented in terms of human consciousness.
And even so we know that Neptune's about altered states of consciousness, spiritual consciousness, and
Yeah,
and altered awareness, or even sometimes delusional or not seeing clearly, or occluded, or purposefully
yes.
occluded consciousness, as that Neptune Saturn in 2024-25 is showing us
Hmm.
themes about
Yeah,
reality and unreality, or was it fake news or alternative facts,
yeah, yeah,
but of course, Neptune in that regard coincides with the human journey of not necessarily seeing things clearly,
yeah.
or seeking to see them more clearly, or understand through a different lens. And that's kind
Hmm.
of part and parcel of, I think, when you talk about your school of evolutionary astrology. Um, um, this idea of the soul's journey. I think you're saying that your work is particularly about the chart describing the soul's journey, not
Yeah.
necessarily even this incarnate experience. In other words, I
Hmm.
think you and I share. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think we kind of you and I are similar in that we shy away from this idea of what I call the dirty P word. This idea of predictive astrology. I think it's a
Yeah,
really
yeah,
a problematical. It's really more rather than prediction. I call it problematical because it's
yeah,
setting in motion a pre-construction that is not, I
yeah,
don't think, real.
yeah. It's astrology is tied into synchronicity, of course, that essentially nothing is random, and of we can predict certain conditions that are likely to arise for a soul as that soul faces certain evolutionary opportunities. That sounds a little vague. Let me focus it. Pardon. If we're in a serious Mars time, for example, from the evolutionary point of view, time to learn some courage. Stand up for yourself, some assertiveness. It's about courage. Doesn't mean you will learn courage. It means you're supposed to. And the opportunity to learn courage will arise. And we can count on that. And implicit in that is a prediction that something scary is probably going to happen, because that's what it takes, for us to learn courage. How we respond to that, who knows? But, we can predict there'll be some stress. Somebody's, abusive to you, mean to you at work, maybe have an accident of some sort. We don't know exactly what it will be. Maybe we can focus it a bit with the symbols, but we'll never be terribly precise. And so that's kind of my view of prediction. It's like I don't completely dismiss the word, but I like to redefine it, that we'll predict the lessons that you're going to be afforded an opportunity to learn, and we can conjecture a bit about the conditions that will arise. Beyond that, who knows? It's up to you. Free will.
Right. Although, on the other hand, when in general I would lecture, speak, present, to general audiences, I'm sure you've done many of that in your earlier years, particularly as I did in my early years, building my practice. People might inquire, what is this? Why astrology? What are you doing? What do you think you're doing? Why a chart? What does a chart mean? So, maybe one of my little slides might be sort of applicable here, to just kind of talk about literally, I as a Capricorn myself, to ground it, to literally see it and ground it in some coincident of my human experience, what I see in a chart. This goes back, 30, 40,000 years, looking at the cycles. So when I look at a chart,
Mhm.
like the chart of the US, I use the Sibley chart. Of course, I use it
Yeah, me
because of,
too.
of, of, of Pluto and Saturn, which I guess you would agree upon, that 9/11
Yeah.
chart was a pretty key thing. You
Yeah,
know, there
absolutely.
there there are
Yeah,
a
that
couple.
pretty much proved it.
Yeah, you made reference earlier that we are a Cancerian nation. So a person's birth chart,
Mhm.
I always tell a client, it tells me what season you're born during. It's not that the planet sun is moving in front of a group of stars per se, or as I call it, an upside down Y. The stars of Cancer look nothing like a crab. It's really about that
Mhm.
season. So the journey through the signs was an early calendrical experience of this season. So we're looking at two things. We're looking at the season of the person's experience, and therefore what is impressing and imprinting that in newborn. I also think the newborn is synaptically connecting super rapidly. You know, and as I said, the dog, the cat, and the little kid are absorbing everything that child is born into during that time. So it's not just that in my case, January 7th, am born as a Capricorn. That is the fact. That is what I experienced. It's also what my mom and dad experienced. And as I say, if I were born in a more northerly climate, I might have come out during a Capricornian blizzard time, which would be the opposite of Cancer, the nation's chart we have, a summertime
Mhm.
sign. I look at our charts, these charts, as describing the season and the time of day. The season and the time of day. So astronomically, it is factual that we have arrived in this incarnation at a certain season, a certain time, and that is imprinting us, and we're imprinting it. I don't know that too many astrologers think about our chart as an event chart in mom and dad's life, but that's what it is. It's
Mhm.
one of the I always say having a human come out of your body has got to be. I have not in this incarnation, but it's a pretty big deal for mom, and that
Yeah,
event
yeah.
of that child is coloring everything that child and that parent dynamic is moving through. So it's
Mhm.
the birth chart is a mirror. It's a mirror of the material, spiritual, and a mirror of those other planes. And I hear that you're doing what many astrologers are afraid to do, is to look at the chart in this kind of karmic energetic way, that everything in the chart's describing
Mhm.
not only this immediate, but this immediate is interwoven with other this synchronicity. Is that a fair way to word your ideas?
Yeah,
Some of your
yeah. Yeah, quite accurate. It's all linked to synchronicity, and of course, as you point out, your birth chart is your mother's transits,
yeah
at the time of the
yeah
birth, and of course, your mother's energy, your mother's experience around the birth has a profound effect on you, on the baby. Here we, of course, enter the realm of psychology, of particularly of infant developmental psychology, which is powerful intrinsically, but when you mix it with astrology, that's when you really get the insights and the full power of it comes through.
I think
I'm very enthusiastic about the marriage of psychology and astrology.
I likewise. I mean, I always say what in terms of Western astrology, which I think has a different ideology than, let's say, Vedic or Tibetan astrology, for
Yeah,
examples. What is it? What's the central driving? What's the thing that really is juicy about American Western astrology, Western
yeah,
astrology? And I think it really is the coincidence of the
yeah,
psychosynthesis, this Jungian kind of model that we're absorbing
yeah,
still. You know, that
yeah,
as above, so below. In other words, everything's interwoven. You can't
yeah,
separate a child entering a marital moment, a marital exiting a mom's body. Those things are all coincident. The reason for astrology, I always say, is that's the inner and outer sky. It's the human experience. Whether you are Inuit or whether you are in Amazonia, uh,
yeah, yeah,
the full moon is the full moon. It is the nature of nature.
yeah,
But
yeah,
those seasonal experiences are what our charts describe. So I always say on the material plane, if I don't go to the karmic, which oftentimes I don't, because as one of my earliest teachers said, many of us, we have more than enough data for now than to necessarily go to the karmic. But those people who are able to watch self or, sort of have a bigger viewpoint, the chart, in other words, is a karmic chart. Everything in the chart
yeah,
describes your karmic journey
yeah,
specifically,
yeah,
and now as it's manifested in this incarnation. Your chart describes your genetics. Your chart describes that moment, literally, the season and the time of day that you
yeah,
came out
yeah.
of mom's body. And all of those things are the same thing. So when I go to
Mhm.
astronomy conferences, in my mind, I wish I could stand up and say, "Excuse me, all my fellow backyard astronomers, but as an astrologer, not only look to identify these cycles, but to interpret the human experience of them."
Yeah, yes. I was encouraged to hear you say that you're finding more acceptance among the backyard astronomers as you confess that you're an astrologer.
I don't I'm cautious to not rock their worldview and get into what might be for some
Mhm.
turbulent waters. But yeah, it used to be 20, 30 years ago, I'd go to Stellafane or, a Winter Star Party or other conferences
Yeah,
that
yeah,
astronomers gather. And if it got around, there was kind of this sense of a cloud more than that hanging over me or about to surround me.
yeah. I can
But
imagine. Yeah,
now,
yeah,
if I dare bring it up or it comes up somehow, there, at 64, I'm now, I guess, suddenly a senior, which is kind of itself kind of a little freaky weird.
yeah. It
Uh,
gives you a certain authority.
but
Yeah, it's I've been amateur astronomer all my life, really, and I've never once been to a astronomy conference. You mentioned Stellafane.
oh,
It's
it's great.
fascinating, but it's like I'm afraid to go, because like I feel like a black person in 1928 attending a Ku Klux Klan rally.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We're not going to talk Dave Chappelle right now, but it's in the back of my mind. It's a famous
Yeah,
Dave Chappelle gig that he did, kind of similar. Yeah, right. Well, that was the truth. It has been since I'm a very, very, very passionate amateur astronomer, it has been a very challenging theme. But as the decades have rolled by, less and less so. So when I have the discussion of astrology with what might be someone who's younger, typically now 40-year-olds or something that are attending the star, their response typically, Stephen, is, "Oh, astrologer, huh? Well, that's interesting. Well, for you to be here and know the sky the way you do, well, so tell me about that. How is that? Tell me about that." In decades
great,
past, it was
great.
it was inflaming.
Yeah.
It was tantamount to my being some kind of horrific social criminal or something.
Yeah, yeah, yes. It's interesting here's a question to which I really don't know the answer. I there's among astronomers, the more conventional ones, there's no scientific evidence for astrology. That's there's which is not exactly true, but that's their often their argument. But there's this will step on some toes, but there's not a whole lot of scientific basis to modern psychology.
Oh,
There's a lot of folklore, and it's helpful. I don't mean that as a put down.
right.
There's zero scientific evidence for the usefulness of basket weaving. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in human experience that isn't in the science category, but doesn't trigger a vitriolic response among scientists. But there's something about astrology that just really triggers these people. And
Yeah,
why?
a great parallel would be that medical science certainly is science, so
Mhm.
even though I'm, fairly fairly skilled for a non-pro medical practitioner, medical diagnostic astrology and such is such an amazing art form and tool in its own
Yeah,
right. But similarly, actually, medical science is medical science, but it's not, the human experience is not uh, fully mechanistic. You don't
yeah,
necessarily add one and one and get two in medical
yeah,
science. It is not always a
yeah,
perfect,
yeah.
scientifically repeatable science.
A lot of intuition in it.
A lot of intuition, a lot of variabilities of the body and form, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
But what is it about astrology that triggers astronomers? Is that they have these projections of what they think we do.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
don't
yeah.
they don't know what we do. It's one reason I am cautious about astrologers now, particularly those who are, I think, brought in, particularly in the Hellenistic school, where they're very focused on what I call the dirty P word. They're focused on prediction. I think that's it's a it's kind of a challenging issue here because for scientists they look at the four forces of physics. Even though we
Mhm.
may have dark energy and dark matter now, in other words, we have quantum and we have a different construct happening, and I think astrology falls perfectly in alignment with those, as probably you do too. They
Yeah.
still will hold us to the rigor of the four forces. So they look at astrology as what's the causal. Now, how is astrology causal? And I think that even amongst astrologers, this is where I was wondering if you and I might wrap, since we're both into
Yeah,
astronomy and astrology,
yeah,
and
yeah,
this
yeah.
idea of you experience. I don't necessarily have to prove the forces of the emotional human experience of being born during a blizzard. Or like
Mhm.
one of my clients years ago, who was born as another fellow Capricorn. He was born during the Blitz, during a Blitz bombing, literally.
Oh,
And one
wow.
could take that information, therapists do, and
Mhm.
extrapolate from there. The chart, of course, we know mirrors. He was born during
Mhm.
a Blitz bombing. You can see
Mhm.
that in his chart, and you can see that in
Mhm.
some of the what's percolated. So
Yeah, yeah.
they're not different. But the
Mhm.
idea that there are astrological forces, although you may know Dr. Percy Seymour back in the 80s did a few books about
Mhm.
astrology and talking about it was really kind of sucked up by the astrology community.
Yeah,
But the idea that it's not so much about magnetism or gravity, but it's really more synchrony. It's
yeah,
more sort of
yeah,
resonance. He talked about resonance being,
yeah,
which of course
yeah.
now we're looking at solar cycles and such and resonance.
Mhm.
But yeah, you're right. Astrology and astronomy, astronomers are still pretty far away from being
Mhm.
willing to even engage the idea
Yeah,
that if you're born in
yeah,
the winter, aka the sun's moving in a certain place in the sky,
yeah,
that in other words is coincident above the equator with winter, that yeah, it generates a certain social model that you're born into, and that's what astrology mirrors to me. Of course, I think there
yeah,
is more to it when we talk eclipses and retrograde Mercuries and so forth.
yeah, yeah. It's a line I like to say is that astrology is quite inconsistent with 19th century physics. You know, the four forces and action at a distance, et cetera, et cetera. In the 21st century, where we are it's scientifically talking about quantum entanglement, for example, you know, atoms on opposite sides of the galaxy, reacting to each other instantaneously in real time. And for me to say astrology works because of quantum entanglement, if I say that to an audience, probably a lot of people are going to think, well, this guy's really smart and I bet he's onto something. I don't know what I'm talking about. And it may have nothing to do with that. I can't really explain quantum entanglement beyond, three or four sentences of a fairly descriptive or superficial nature. Maybe it has something to do with how astrology works, but I'm inclined to go with the synchronicity argument because here's really the heart of the matter. There are financial astrologers who have made a lot of money looking at the initial public offering charts of publicly traded companies. You can buy the stock 9:30 a.m. Monday morning, New York City. It's pretty easy to get accurate charts on these things. And it's just a fact, and objectively they make money and these charts work. Now, the reason I say that is that so many of the attempts to bridge scientific language with astrological language depend on some interaction of geomagnetic forces or whatever with usually with the Earth's field, and then to the child whose electromagnetic relationship with the environment shifts when the child is no longer being energy conducted through the amniotic fluid, and blah blah quack quack quack. It can sort of go on like
Yeah.
this and
Yes.
make a sort of plausible
Make a
scientific
case. Yes.
argument, and it may even be true. It may even be real. I could go into more detail about that, but that's the general shape of it. And yet an IPO chart, an initial public offering chart, there's no body. It's nothing but a social agreement. It's a moment in time that people have assigned meaning to. Here's this company. And so all the fact that those charts work proves that astrology is operating outside the framework of push and shove physics and causality as we conventionally understand it. I point to those, corporate charts, but a good horror astrologer, where did I
Mhm.
lose my wallet? They set up a chart and help you find the wallet. Again, there's
Yeah.
no body. It's just a moment of time, and that each moment of time, well, you can see the universe in a grain of sand, so to speak, and each moment of time is such a grain of sand.
Kind of the Mandelbrot, sort of the
Yeah,
Mandelbrot of the moment.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Well said. Well
yeah.
said.
Right. The interweaving, and that kind of full circle, no pun intended about charts, but full circle, I think, is where as a practitioner, I use super wide orbs. I look at I think one of my friends who was a Tillite. He was one of Noel's students for many years, and he said, "Well, Noel's idea, Noel's a very well-known astrologer. For those who don't know, Noel Till's ideas were, what's the proper orb for aspects? 360 degrees. So, in other words, his reference is not so much what works, but understanding that there's an interweaving of it all. That so,
Yeah,
again back to where we started before we went on recording. Ideas I have like what time are you born? What time did you come in? What season were you born in? What time of day? Were you
yeah,
born in the nighttime quadrants or the daytime quadrants? That's not
yeah,
only what's imprinted on you, but where the event of you entering mom's body, exiting mom's body, and entering the marital dynamic, if you will, of the childhood dynamic, your event in their lives is unconsciously molding them.
yeah,
So
yeah,
things like, we have teachings that the ascendant, like Jung's, persona, that the ascendant describes your body or your sense of yourself. But I
yeah,
also want to say the ascendant, your birth chart as let's say a family event chart, a horary chart of that moment of this child born. Your ascendant describes mom and dad's construct unconsciously for this event as it's occurring in their lives and how they make sense of this baby in their field. in their sense
Yeah.
of being, which is another
Yeah.
way of saying what we were just discussing, the inner sky, the outer sky, as above, so below. This idea of interweaving, there's no separation. But I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
astrologers have this two-dimensional page, this computer screen, and we don't see the sky. We don't
Hmm.
understand it in a reference point to the collective, the whole.
Hmm.
We just look at it as longitudinal, zodiacal longitude, and that's the
Yeah.
only part of our experience that we're really grokking from a
Yeah.
two-dimensional wheel. But these are
Yeah.
complex themes. We can go on about these themes and
Hmm.
ideas,
Yeah.
for hours and hours. But
Yeah.
as we
Yeah.
come to
And why
close this,
not?
yeah, why not? But they're important. I think, Stephen, they're important ideas. I think it's a
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
important idea that our birth chart is not just a mirror of the moment of this person's physical, spiritual, physical, environmental existency. I agree wholeheartedly, as I may have shared in an email to you. One of my first lectures for the NCGR on Long Island, where I was born, was on karmic astrology and the nature of the soul in the chart, and how it really,
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
planetary placement and relationship describes that soul stepping into this incarnation and
Yeah.
continuing
Exactly.
onward. So
The
I'm
chart is
wondering,
the
thoughts on
The
them.
chart is I'm just reacting to your comment about the chart is not just the moment. What I wanted to throw in is the chart is actually the summation of all the moments that led to this moment
Yeah.
of birth.
Yeah, I think I know we got to close shortly, but in Vedic astrology collectively, I believe one thing I've taken, I have not studied Vedic, and I'm guessing you might know a lot more than
Yeah, I
I,
don't know much about it. Yeah,
but
I
the
respect
moon,
it, but yeah,
yeah, the moon collectively symbolizes the journey of the soul. Am I mistaken in that? I believe that's what I've heard from Vedic, that the moon is
yeah.
the repository of sort of thinking about the soul's journey, which by the way, I believe the semicircle, the Christian, Judeo-Christian mystical symbol, the semicircle of soul joined to another semicircle of soul, the soul reflected upon itself is the glyph. And so, the moon in Tibetan and Vedic astrology talk about the journey of the soul and its more recent incarnations. So
Mhm.
that's their standpoint. That, as you say, it's all interwoven. There is no separation. So I'm kind of wondering, yeah, closing thoughts, closing
Yeah,
ideas, and more about Stephen and your
yeah,
evolutionary
yeah,
school.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
I'd,
what
I'd
what
like
can
to
yeah,
I'd like to throw in something. You were talking about aspects and orbs a little while ago, and then we went down various rabbit holes that were fun to explore.
yeah,
But I want to go down a rabbit hole connected with orbs.
please,
I love your reference to Noel Till and what a soul he was.
yeah,
But
the
uh,
character,
but the the notion of first, the most boring thing in the world for me astrologically is somebody who quibbles about whether a sextile is 5 degrees or 6 degrees. But this is a drum I like to beat. That I'll start off with a very obvious statement that if you use generous orbs, if you use wide orbs, you got more aspects. If you use less orbs, of course, or smaller orbs, fewer aspects. The logic is, of course, unassailable there. And then I would add that, generally speaking, the more precise an aspect is, the more energetic it is. And so by using narrow orbs, we filter for the most important aspects, and we have fewer of them. Generous orbs, more aspects, including less important ones, but they're still effective. And so all that's pretty obvious. None of that's brilliant insight. But here's why I'm saying it. This is the drum I love to beat. That where we're talking here not about technical astrology, but about the mind training of the astrologer. So there are some of us whose consciousness, whose intelligence is wired in such a way that we're able to deal with a whole lot of different concepts at the same time and sort of intuit a pattern with them. Fine, use generous orbs if that's the kind of mind you have. Others work best if they can go deeply into major interactions among the most important points, without being distracted by detail. That's another form of intelligence. If you're that kind of person, use the narrower orbs. In other words, adjust your astrological technique to your consciousness rather than letting somebody sit on the papal throne and announce that sextiles are 5 degrees, not 6 degrees. It's like consciousness interacting with astrology. And it's like, I love to talk about that because hardly anybody does. The mind training of an astrologer and the personalizing of our relationship with the system.
I think again, you're speaking my language. I know well, astronomically speaking, we're given these constructs, I call it astrology 101, these constructs of what we do learn and what we may pass on to our students as well as foundation points. Sometimes, I approach it from sort of like, I guess I want to say back asswards, I approach it in a different way. I approach it from the phenomenological. So we might not have a conjunction or a super wide conjunction like 15, 20 degrees, 25 degrees even. Would an astrologer typically call it a conjunction? They all drum me out. They want to know, Alexander, he's way off on this one. But I always say observationally, that's not the case. The
Mhm.
roots of our astrology, astronomy profession and exploration go back 45, 50, 60, really maybe fire and stars to the earliest humanoid, the earliest,
Mhm.
sort of pre-Lucy and so forth. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
so we're really talking about the experience of it. What is the experience of those cycles when we see a crescent moon at sunset and Jupiter or Venus, somewhere near it, whether they're really astrologically conjoined or whether they're actually maybe 15 degrees. I always say, one pinky, 1 degree at arm's length, 10 degrees, 15 degrees. When things
Yeah.
are visually close to each other in terms of the 360 circle, for an observer, there's that Venus Moon super conjunction. Wow, look at that apparition, for the astronomer.
Hmm.
For the astrologer, oh no, they're too far apart to be conjunct. I said, I don't see that. I see them as
Yeah.
being a phenomenon that was, we're looking at cycles, lunar Venus cycle perhaps. We're looking at the cycles of astrology, but we're also having an experiential, which again talks about other things in astrology, that two-dimensional uh, zodiacal longitude versus declination or zodiacal latitude,
Hmm. Hmm.
things that
Hmm.
astrologers don't ever consider. They don't ever consider
Yeah.
what's the visual apparition of a chart. What's the most elevated planet in a chart? If those proportional houses are off, or if that zodiac's highest midheaven, that midheaven is altered, to the east or to the west slightly, you have a,
Yeah.
a shift in the chart, like the U.S. chart. We think of Saturn being at the top of the U.S. chart, but really, when you look at proportional houses, the astronomical sky, Neptune is the planet that's the most elevated. That is
Hmm.
the social cultural construct that the world experiences. The U.S. Hollywood, Neptune. Oh,
Yeah.
we all know
Yeah.
that. But I think again we're kind of on the same page here. That
Yeah.
this idea. Well, I guess I want to say both are good. To be really
Hmm.
tight with orbs and simultaneously to be observant of the sky.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
what
They're
are we
both true.
looking
They're
at?
both valid. And I
Yeah, yeah.
love you beating the drum of how important it is to actually look at the sky. The original ephemeris has so much to teach us. I did a conference once with a Native American man named J.C. Eaglesmith, a
Oh.
very, very impressive man, an impressive presence. And,
Hmm.
and he 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 told this is a really sad story. He spoke of being featured at an astrology conference. This is one that I did not attend, and he tells the story very straight-faced. He said, I asked everybody at the conference if they would come outside and look at the sky with me, and they said, no, there are mosquitoes. That was, and
Yeah.
it was just, simple, the exact words virtually. And it was just such a sad moment that, people, astrologers were letting mosquitoes prevent them from actually looking at the original ephemeris, the direct experience of the
Well,
sky.
I love that. That might be, I know your time is precious too. So we'll close maybe on that note. But
Yeah,
the original ephemeris. I mean, that is the ultimate and penultimate both of my
yeah,
application of
yeah.
astrology.
That's
It
how we
is
both entered it.
that
Hmm.
right. That's right.
Yeah,
And it
yeah,
still is it is what we do. I think most astrologers don't think about the sky. They don't think about
yeah,
the experience.
yeah,
So I'll leave you with this, that when I see people with a fall or winter time, I call it fall winter time sign, whether it's their sun or their moon or their Venus, as we know, one of those mysteries of astrology, having a sun sign, being born at a certain season, well, that's a social imprint. But how is it
yeah,
and why is it if our moon happens to be in a wintertime sign, it also carries that wintertime charge to it. But it
yeah,
does imply that nonetheless, as we know. And so that phenomenon of that experience of the seasons and the time of day. The seasons and the time of day are interwoven with the chart and how we read it and what that person experienced is kind of and or what this birth in the family is uh, is inspiring or evoking. Those are
yeah,
other
yeah,
ways.
exactly,
Perfect.
exactly.
Well, thank you,
Yeah, well,
Stephen.
thank you too. This has been fun.
It's been really wonderful. It's
Yeah,
great to be with a fellow astronomer, astrologer, and
yeah, yeah.
one day it'd be great to get you at an eyepiece or vice versa and do some sky touring because it
I
certainly is a
love that. Yeah,
fantastic
I
thing.
envy you that C14. That looks like a wonderful instrument.
I'll leave you with this. It's the most incredible thing I've ever seen visually. Was at the
Hmm.
Winter Star Party where the upper atmosphere is super steady and there's no twinkle of stars. You have no mountains for 1,000 miles. And one fellow had a 30-inch F2,
Oh,
F3 scope. So we're up at a
oh,
16-foot cherry picker ladder looking in the trapezium. And the night was so steady. It was like sub-arc second seeing that night, planetary seeing, super, super amazing. We were seeing tendrils of the Orion Nebula gas congeal, and where there was a star like the Eagle Nebula at the very tip, you saw that star had ignited not long ago in history by
yeah.
human standards, very
Wow.
long, but to see it in a level I can't describe. It was like an
Yeah.
episode of Star Trek when we were kids. Anyway, Stephen, you're delightful. Thank you so much for sharing this time with me. I so
Thank you. I've
appreciate
enjoyed
it.
it too. Take good care. God
You too.
bless.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Blessings to you. Take care. Bye bye
Bye.
now.